I am about to introduce the second of our standalone keynotes, effectively. With me, in fact, is not Andy Altman, but Neil Brenner. Neil Brenner is a professor of urban theory at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Neil, I already alluded to his work earlier as what I would call a critical thinker in reframing what urbanism actually is about. And that is exactly why we've invited Neil to, in a way, share with us and with you his ideas, which is very much the summary of collective work done by a very interdisciplinary group of geographers, of architects, of planners, of social scientists. In fact, you have a degree yourself in political science on this very issue. So it's my pleasure to welcome Neil for the first time to the Urban Age, and will you join me in welcoming Neil Brenner? Thank you.
So thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. Yes. It was among the many remarkable moments of this already very full day, for me, occurred very early on. Amazing to hear the director of UN Habitat say that we need a new framework for thinking about urbanization. And I thoroughly agree with that, and more generally, I very strongly believe in the need to think through the concepts that we're using to think about the questions that are at stake in this conference. So we've already been debating about the nature of governance and the nature of the urban, and I want to kind of pick up on those threads and take them in a couple of different directions. And the question at hand here in my 15 minutes is, what is the appropriate scale of urban governance? This is a question that has been debated for at least 100 years by theorists of urban governance and by practitioners. Generally, the question is defined in terms of the governance of city expansion. And in that context, many different scalar rubrics are brought into play. The city, the region, the metropolis, the conurbation, sometimes all the way up to the megalopolis. However, if you reframe the question not simply as a question about the governance of cities, but as a question about the governance of urbanization, many other scales come into play, and very quickly the problem becomes even more complicated. The problem becomes national, continental, and indeed planetary. So I'm going to complicate things a little bit and hopefully open up some questions that probably we can't resolve today, but I think they're important to think about and to debate about. So my title is Urban Governance, but at what scale? A somewhat more provocative title is urban governance and our concern with urban governance actually a symptom of weakness, a symptom of lack of capacity to confront some of the fundamental processes and transformations that we have to deal with in contemporary capitalism. So let me take a step back from these big questions and just frame the analysis by contextualizing it. So the context in which these questions are emerging today, a rapid-fire summary would consist of a few different elements. Ongoing global economic and financial crisis, processes of national state restructuring that dramatically accelerated since the global economic crises of the 1970s, new forms of market-oriented governance, in the contemporary period post-global financial crisis, a politics of austerity, and of course, explosive worldwide urbanization. The very occasion for this series of conferences is indeed how to understand what these worldwide processes of urbanization are all about, and intensifying environmental crisis. Local governments are obviously at the front lines, confronting any number of different dimensions of these transformations. Economic growth, public health, housing, transportation, water, land expansion, environmental insecurity, many issues that we have already discussed and which we will continue to discuss in the next 2 days. Since roughly the 1970s, I would argue there's been a dramatic proliferation of local regulatory experiments around the world. There's obviously a long history of experimentation in governance at the local level, but I would argue that the intensity of such experiments has grown since the 1970s. So experiments mobilized from below without necessarily being directly coordinated by national governments or even provincial and regional governments in the context of a quest to position a locality or a city in the global system. So indeed, the Urban Age project is very much an attempt to make sense of what some of those local regulatory experiments are all about and what some of their conditions are in different contexts around the world. And this is, of course, occurring in a broader context in which cities are trying to create new networks, to share knowledge, to diffuse best practices of urban governance among cities under conditions in which broader governance systems are increasingly volatile. And there are many examples of this. Perhaps one of the most well-known, and which I think we'll hear about more at this conference, is the C40 project, trying to diffuse best practices around responses to climate change. So the politics of local governance have been differentiating in a variety of different ways since the 1970s. There are certainly many economic projects, as mentioned, about positioning a local economy within a locality in some way within the broader global economy, but there are many other dimensions of these local regulatory experiments. Many these days are around environmental adaptation, climate change, notions of resilience and adaptation. There's also a radical democratic politics around increasing participation and the notion of the right to the city. So we don't want to homogenize these local regulatory experiments. They occur in very different political, institutional forms around the world. But it seems to me that one of the major forms in which these local regulatory experiments has occurred might be described as global urbanism, a political strategy that involves narrating a locality in a particular way in order to position it strategically in relation to global flows of capital. And during the last couple of decades, there are a variety of different discourses, ideologies, which attempt to do that narration. Entrepreneurial cities, global and world cities, creative cities, smart cities. We've already heard quite a bit about sustainable cities and eco-cities. So the notion of global urbanism, positioning your urban society economy strategically in a global network via some kind of a narrative. So the question that I would like to reflect on against the background of this very rapid overview of a couple of decades of global structuring is this. To what degree, it seems to me, we have to ask, can locally scaled forms of urban governance offer an adequate basis for confronting the great problems of early 21st century global capitalism, economy, society, politics, and environment? It seems clear to me that a lot of local strategies are emerging that aspire to do just this, and that claim to do just this. Very celebratory localisms. Again, many different political inflections, but very celebratory of the capacity of the local to confront these questions. So it seems to me, or to confront these problems, it seems to me we need to critically evaluate whether localities can indeed do that, to what degree they can, to what degree they fail. So I want to offer a cautionary argument in relation to this question. It's obviously up for debate, and part of my goal here is just to provoke a debate about it. It seems to me it's something we need to constantly discuss. So we urgently need urban governance. So I don't want to come across as rejecting the local or the urban. The urban is fundamental. It is strategic, as Saskia Sassen has been arguing for many years. I agree with that. But I want to suggest there are serious operational limits to purely local strategies for the regulation of early 21st century urbanization processes. So in contrast to these celebratory viewpoints, it seems to me we have to ask this question, to which I alluded at the outset: what if urban governance is actually no more than a weapon of the weak, a symptom of our weakness to confront these broader questions? I don't know if I want to argue that it is a weapon of the weak, but it seems to me it's a question that is very productive to explore in evaluating what the potentials are for some of the regulatory experiments that we're concerned with. So I'll make three cautionary arguments in relation to these celebratory localisms. The first, which has actually already been made many times today, and which I can therefore very quickly resume, it's been made by Jerry Frug, among others, the regulatory capacities of cities and local governments are not defined by themselves. They're circumscribed by national intergovernmental systems, and those national intergovernmental systems may empower suburbs. They may empower rural areas. They may empower low population areas, and they may empower other tiers of governance. That point has been made several times already. it actually needs to be put into bold, underline, large font, because we frequently forget that in discussing things that we care about at the local level. And in order to confront them, we need to continue to mobilize at broader tiers. It's also been mentioned, appropriately, that national intergovernmental systems around the world are undergoing major transformations these days around devolution and decentralization. We need to have a critical view about the limits and the possibilities of what decentralization and devolution can offer. They may open up new opportunities for local regulatory experimentation, but they may also impose new constraints. If you devolve a responsibility without capacity, including physical capacity, then you're basically offloading problems from central government down to the local. And particularly in an age of austerity, I see that happening all over the place. And that it seems to me we need to have a very critical view. Maybe we can exploit the possibilities of devolution and decentralization, but we need to do so within a framework that actually gives local governments, municipal governments, the capacities they need to confront the issues to which they are assigned. So I'll skip some of this because the point has already been made, but obviously many struggles around austerity all around the world, precisely around these issues, many people mobilizing to defend the continued role of public institutions in confronting some of the big problems of our society. This leads to a second kind of cautionary argument that I would like to make about the limits to these local initiatives. And this actually goes back to the question of how we conceptualize urbanization itself. The dominant view of urbanization throughout the 20th century up to the present, with a few important exceptions, is that urbanization is the growth of cities. But I want to argue for something else, that in fact, even though urbanization does involve agglomeration and city growth, it also involves a variety of social, territorial transformations, transformations of landscape and environment that occur in order to support the growth of agglomerations. So large-scale planetary and metabolic flows are mobilized in order to create the giant megacities that occupy so much of our attention. And we need to bring those metabolic flows, those transformations of territory, of landscape and environment into our discussion about governance beyond the city, but which nonetheless support city growth. So in the research group that I've been working in at the Graduate School of Design, the Urban Theory Lab, we've been describing these and studying these under the rubric of extended urbanization. Not simply concentrated urbanization, the concentration and agglomeration of people, investment, and so forth, but the broader ways in which regions, territories, and landscapes are operationalized in order to support big cities, big megacities. Issues of food, energy, water, materials, labor, and waste. Every one of those issues has already quite appropriately been brought into this discussion, but mainly at the city scale. Those are planetary issues. Planetary transformations are occurring in order to supply cities on each of those axes. So, and this generates major governance issues. So issues that are geo-governance issues, geopolitical issues around energy and resource supply chains, around transnational migration patterns, in part through the dislocations in the erstwhile countryside that are induced in order to support urban growth, large-scale environmental footprints, to which it's already been alluded to, and large-scale social impacts. Big challenges arise with simply trying to understand the many different geographies of extended urbanization. They're not simply territorial. But just to sort of open up this problematique and perhaps bring it into discussion, geospatial maps, very simple geospatial data, can actually open up that question. It doesn't resolve it, but it opens it up in quite productive ways. So maps of urban land cover and urban population size tend to emphasize concentrated urbanization, the clustering together of people and infrastructure in space. But we have lots of geospatial data on many other dynamics and dimensions of social environmental transformation that bring extended urbanization into focus. So ambient population density, impervious surfaces and hardscapes, infrastructures that support urbanization, but which themselves may not involve the massive clustering together of people. Croplands. So you can't have big cities unless you have crops in order to supply the cities with food. Infrastructures of transportation and circulation. connectivity, geographies of connectivity within and among cities and beyond. And this is one particular vision of the so-called environmental footprint of the South Asian urban landscape. A lot could be said about that, but it at least starts to, as it were, fill up the territory with many different types of transformations that I would argue are occurring precisely in relation to the growth of the big cities. They're not outside. We can call it rural if we want to, but only if we really think of the urban and the rural as dialectically interconnected. I'd rather call it extended urbanization than the rural. So, and just one last attempt on this. So we've been studying the Himalayas in the Urban Theory Lab and the ways in which hydroelectric infrastructures are operationalizing the Himalayas in order to supply significant parts of South Asia with water. So for us, the Himalayas, even though they may not have the population densities of the big South Asian cities, become part of a broader urban fabric. So we need, for example, to include the Himalayas within our map of the urban geography of not just South Asia, but of the world. So I am getting red carded, so I'm going to skip some of these other points and basically just conclude. So the point of all this is to really open up a discussion. I don't have the answers to this, but it seems to me these questions are ones that it is productive to think about. Local strategies for the regulation of early 21st century are emerging, and they're very important, and we care about them, and we should care about them. But I want to argue that their conditions of possibility, their parameters for actually being actualized, and their impacts are not simply local. They're national, they're continental, and they're ultimately planetary. So in terms of interpreting all of this, interpreting this kind of new localism, obviously I'm critical of celebratory views because even if they may offer pathways to solving certain kinds of problems, we need broader scalings of governance in order to really confront them. The pessimistic view around which I framed these remarks is probably too pessimistic, but it's intended as a provocation. So maybe it's not totally a weapon of the weak, but if we fetishize the local, then we risk fetishizing a scale that actually weakens us rather than enables us. So the strategy that I'm kind of thinking through in relation to these questions is to think of these localisms as a kind of tactical maneuver under conditions of volatility and possible retreat. So we need to use the local, but we need to use it in order to open up some of these broader questions, which again, for me, the core issue that I want to put on the table for our discussion is the governance, not just of cities, not just of concentrated urbanization, but of the relationship between concentrated and extended urbanization. In other words, there are governance problems associated with the ways in which the entire world is being transformed in order to supply the big cities with their most basic metabolic functions. And it seems to me that broader scale has to be part of our conversation, along with the local and regional and metropolitan scales. Thank you very much.
Neil, it's an incredibly powerful argument. Basically you're saying, let's not totally focus on urban governance, but let's focus on governing urbanization, whatever that is. Right? I said it more quickly than he did. I said it more quickly, right?
You could have just said that and we would be done. Simple as that.
So no. So therefore, we have to be careful, cautionary tales about the different systems that we have, and particularly the new movements, which are very localized. Does that mean that actually the supranatural, the multilateral organizations which exist, the United Nations,
yes,
for example, I won't go through the long list, are okay?
What do you mean, okay?
Are they, in their hands, can we rest assured that all these big, transnational patterns that you've discussed can actually be dealt with? Or are we thinking of another system which might make that sort of multilateral existing system even more complex?
Yeah, so I definitely don't have the answer to that question, but it's one that I would love to really deeply discuss and explore. In other words, what would be the appropriate institutional framework through which to confront these challenges? Part of the problem from my point of view, and the main goal of this presentation, was simply to say that the dominant way in which global urbanization is framed actually constrains our ability to pose precisely that question. If we think about this in terms of 50% of the world's population or more now lives within cities, and then the rural is kind of an outside that's been rendered more or less irrelevant to the urban age, we can't pose this question. And the notion of extended urbanization as an alternative to the urban-rural divide, it opens up that question. Because we have to think of the big megacities that we've been talking about and mapping as being connected to very complex socio-environmental, territorial, landscape transformations beyond the cities.
Just to prove the point that everything Neil is telling us is something we at the Urban Age have taken very seriously, so much so that if you look at some of the maps in our report, we're not just looking at where the cities start and end, but very much the sort of the fabric and very difficult definition of what is rural, what is urban, and what is nothing. And as you're saying, nothing is not necessarily nothing, and I think that's extremely interesting. So that is very much the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We're going to end that there. Can you please thank Neil?